This is the number that should have solved the problem and somehow made it worse. More than 23,000 Burmese pythons removed from Florida, and biologists still estimate only about 1% are ever seen or captured. Sit with that for a second. A state can pull snake after snake after snake out of the Everglades, hold public challenges, fund contractors, patrol levees at night, and still barely touch the population it is trying to stop. So eventually the question changed. Not how do you hunt them harder? How do you break the next generation before it disappears into the grass? That is when the strangest weapon of all entered the story. A dead mouse. Florida has been fighting this snake so long that the fight has started to feel normal. That may be the most dangerous part of it. The Burmese python is no longer a shocking headline here. It is infrastructure. It is policy. It is budget lines, permit systems, training classes, dispatch routes, contractor logs, and state maps marked with access points and removal zones. It is a permanent campaign against an animal that did not evolve in this wet maze and yet now moves through it as if the Everglades had been waiting for it all along. The old explanation sounded reasonable for years. Find more snakes, train more people, expand the challenge, improve the gear, build a bigger response. Eventually removal will catch up. Eventually pressure will work. Eventually the population curve bends. That was the faith built into almost every public-facing version of the story. Maybe not today, maybe not this season, but soon. Then the numbers kept refusing to behave. More than 23,000 pythons have already been removed from Florida. That is not rumor. That is not social media inflation. That is a real count of animals taken off the landscape. And even with that, field biologists still say the total represents only a fraction of what is out there because the snakes are so hard to detect that only about 1% are ever seen or captured. 1%? The number keeps coming back because it changes how every other number feels. 1,000 removals sounds large until you realize the problem may be 100 times larger than the removal count you can see. And while people have gotten better at taking individual snakes off the board, the snakes have not stopped reproducing. The federal researchers studying Burmese python reproduction report clutches from 11 eggs to 111, not 1 or 2, not the slow pace people imagine when they think of large reptiles. 11 to 111, the species does not need perfect survival to win. It just needs enough young to vanish into habitat so dense, wet, and visually chaotic that human eyes lose the contest almost immediately. This is where the script most people tell breaks. The usual version says Florida needs more effort. The colder version says Florida may be applying effort to the wrong life stage. Adults are huge, secretive, and incredibly difficult to detect. Juveniles are smaller, hungrier, and far more exposed to the one thing all populations depend on: food. Now imagine the official story, stripped of politics and fed into a cold model. No speeches, no press conference language, no emotional stake, just inputs. More than 23,000 removals, roughly 1% detection, egg counts that can reach into triple digits, published evidence that native mammals in heavily invaded areas have crashed by over 90%, with raccoons down by 99.3%, opossums by 98.9%, and bobcats by 87.5%. The machine does not care what solution sounds heroic. It only looks for leverage points. And the first leverage point it finds is not the giant snake across the road that makes the news. It is the small one you never see. That is the first hard turn in this story. The adult python is the symbol. The juvenile python is the vulnerability. If you stop enough juveniles from surviving, you are not just removing snakes. You are cutting the future supply line. That is the kind of answer a machine likes because it is brutally simple. Population growth lives or dies in the stage you can most efficiently interrupt. Florida did not invent the next idea. It borrowed it from a place that had already learned what an invasive snake can do to a living system when the balance breaks and keeps breaking for decades. Thousands of miles west of South Florida, on Guam, another snake once arrived in a way that sounded almost too ordinary to matter. Cargo, movement, human traffic, a species in the wrong place at the wrong time, dropped into an ecosystem that had not built defenses against it. The brown tree snake was not enormous. It was not the kind of animal that makes a monster out of itself on sight. But size was never the point. Access was. Guam paid for that lesson in silence. By the time federal agencies were deeply involved, the island had lost all but 2 of its 12 native forest birds. Think about what kind of ecological violence is required to change a forest so completely that bird life stops being background and starts becoming memory. It does not happen in one season. It happens slowly enough that people tell themselves the next season may be different, right up until the absence becomes the new normal. The snake did more than strip sound out of the forest. It caused millions of dollars in damage to Guam's electrical grid. It spread through terrain that was hard to patrol and harder to cleanly defend. Traditional control methods never gave managers what they needed most: scale. The problem was too distributed for a simple hunt, too hidden for a simple trap, too constant for a simple barrier. That is when the most unsettling part of the Guam story appeared. Not a secret military chemical, not a futuristic biotech weapon, acetaminophen, the active ingredient people know from ordinary pain relievers. For brown tree snakes, federal researchers found that dead mice carrying 80 milligram acetaminophen tablets could function as lethal bait. The delivery method was as strange as the chemistry. The mouse was fitted with a small biodegradable streamer so it could catch in the tree canopy, right where the snakes hunted, not on the ground, in the branches. The idea sounds absurd until you understand how precise it is. You're not poisoning a whole landscape in one crude sweep. You are trying to place a lethal object exactly where the target species is most likely to encounter it first. In Guam, the strategy became important enough to earn federal recognition as a critical step toward large area control. And that alone tells you something. In an invasive species crisis, agencies do not praise a method just because it is imaginative. They praise it because it solves a deployment problem older methods could not. And once that precedent existed, once a toxicant delivered inside a dead mouse had already crossed from weird idea to real management tool, the next question became unavoidable. Could the same weakness exist in other invasive reptiles too? For Florida, that question pointed straight at the python. A toxicology study on juvenile Burmese pythons delivered the kind of result that makes officials sit back in their chairs. At 20 milligrams of acetaminophen, mortality was 14.3%. At 40 milligrams, it rose to 85.7%. At 80 milligrams, mortality reached 100% in the juvenile sample. 100%. No drama added, no narration needed. A juvenile python offered the right dose did not survive. That is the moment this story changes shape. Until then, the dead mouse is just a bizarre footnote from another island. After that result, it becomes a real possibility. Not for the giant adults people imagine when they hear the word python, for the young. For the first year, animals small enough to take rodents and curious enough to investigate the wrong thing at the wrong time. And that is where the machine match becomes almost eerie. Take the Guam delivery logic and place it over juvenile python biology. Juveniles hunt small prey. Juveniles move through vegetation differently than full-grown adults. Juveniles are the life stage population models are most interested in when the goal is long-term suppression. Then add telemetry research from federal teams in the greater Everglades. Researchers are now tracking hatchlings and following juvenile survival through time because age-specific survival rates may reveal exactly which stage matters most for control. That is not theory anymore. That is an active research priority. The overlap is obvious enough that you almost distrust it. A bait size juveniles will eat, a toxin juveniles are vulnerable to. A delivery concept already proven useful against another invasive snake. A landscape where adult detection remains brutally low. The kind of fit that makes a strategy look inevitable. If you want to know the moment this stopped sounding clever and started sounding dangerous, stay with me. It is very close. Because the Everglades is not Guam. That difference is not a detail, it is the whole story. Guam's brown tree snake campaign emerged in an ecosystem already devastated by the invasion it was trying to contain. Florida is different. The Everglades is damaged by pythons, yes, deeply damaged. But it is still one of the most layered ecological systems in North America. It is still full of movement, overlap, scavenging, opportunism, and species interactions that do not care what a management plan intended. A dead mouse in that system is never just a dead mouse. It is a signal. It is food. It is an event in the food web. The cold model sees that immediately. Run the juvenile bait idea into an ecosystem map, and the first problem is not whether pythons would take it. The first problem is who else would? Raccoons, opossums, birds, native snakes, small mammals already moving through edge habitat, wading birds scanning low vegetation, scavengers that do not need to be predators to become exposed. The same landscape that hides pythons also houses everything else trying to live around them. The Everglades does not separate species neatly for us, it stacks them. Florida's mammal collapse makes this even darker. In heavily invaded parts of the Everglades, researchers report medium-sized mammals have declined by over 90%. Raccoons are down 99.3%. Opossums, 98.9%. Bobcats, 87.5%. Rabbits and foxes have disappeared from many areas of successful invasion. That damage is often used to explain why Florida must act harder against pythons. Fair enough. But it creates a second truth at the same time. The surviving native animals are already operating with thinner margins. In a stressed system, collateral damage hurts more. The old explanation says a poisoned bait can be targeted. The colder explanation says target is not the same thing as exclusivity. That distinction matters. A weapon can be effective against the animal you want dead and still be unacceptable inside the place you are trying to save. That is the contradiction sitting at the heart of this story. At first glance, the logic feels irresistible. Adult pythons are too hard to detect. Juveniles are not. Cut juvenile survival and you cut future adults. It sounds elegant because it is elegant, but ecosystems are under no obligation to honor elegant plans. They answer with contact rates, feeding behavior, seasonality, chance, and overlap. The machine does not look at your intention. It looks at your exposure pathways, and once you look there, the shadows get crowded. Start with the most obvious risk. A bait meant for a young python is also the right size for other foragers. Not every animal will take it. It does not need to. In a landscape, this complex low probability, repeated across very large-scale operations, is no longer low. It becomes inevitable. That is the arithmetic conservation planners hate most, because it does not sound dramatic at first. One event is rare. 1 million events are not. Then there is secondary exposure. Even if a species does not take the bait directly, it can still encounter the compound through another prey item or scavenged tissue. Wildlife control history is full of interventions that looked narrow on paper and widened in reality because living systems move matter upward, sideways, and back again. You do not get to choose what stays isolated once it enters a food web. The food web chooses for you. And in South Florida, there's one species that turns this from a management headache into something close to a moral test: the Florida panther. Official state information places the Florida panther population at roughly 120 to 230 adult animals. That is not a large margin. That is not resilience. That is a species surviving inside a narrow corridor of chance, conservation work, and constant pressure from roads, habitat loss, and isolation. South of Lake Okeechobee remains the core range, the same general world where python control is not an abstract conversation, but an active necessity. Now feed that number into the same cold analysis, 120 to 230. That is all. Once a population gets that small, every management action around it changes weight. A method that would be tolerable in a robust species becomes terrifying in a fragile one. A slight increase in accidental mortality is no longer a side effect. It is a threat multiplier. And the python problem does not politely sit somewhere else. That is the nightmare geometry. The invasive predator, you need to suppress lives in the same broad region as one of the rarest large cats in the United States. The overlapping map is what matters. Not what people hope, not what people promise. Overlap. The machine does not romanticize apex predators. It does not tell itself a large cat would ignore an easy meal because the cat is noble or cautious or symbolic. It only asks whether a hungry opportunist moving through cover might investigate carrion-sized food. If the answer is yes, even occasionally, the risk enters the model. Once it enters, it stays there. This is where the story gets more uncomfortable than the headline suggests. People hear about mice and think small scale, harmless scale, almost comic scale. But the entire concept only works if it scales beyond anything that feels local. You do not alter python recruitment in South Florida with a handful of bait stations. The logic depends on distribution at a density and frequency large enough to matter across habitat. The more effective the strategy becomes, the wider the exposure web it must create. And that means the better the idea works on paper, the more frightening it becomes in practice. The same coldness that makes machine analysis so persuasive also makes it hard to escape. You can tell yourself the bait would be engineered carefully. You can point to timing, placement, habitat filters, monitoring. All of that matters. All of it should exist. But the model keeps returning to the same issue. Non-target encounter is not an exception you fully design away. It is a tax you keep paying and hoping remains low enough not to break something you cannot repair. This is why some of the most important python research in Florida has started moving in other directions. Federal teams are developing abundance estimates from removal data. They are using radio-tracked scout snakes to locate breeding aggregations. They are trying to identify the ages that most strongly affect population growth. There is growing interest in genetic biocontrol as a long-term suppression pathway. Detection dogs have shown real promise. Collared snakes have led researchers to other snakes. Managers are trying to let the species reveal itself instead of simply waiting to stumble across it. That is not because the mouse idea is too strange. It is because the Everglades made punish elegant shortcuts harder than people expect. Still, the temptation keeps returning, because the python numbers do not care that Florida is being careful. Every year the snakes remain established, more of the system shifts around them. Native prey falls, native predators adjust, disease pathways move, human removal continues, but no one in the field confuses effort with victory. The snake is not just surviving in the Everglades, it is participating in it now. The landscape has started to absorb its presence even while suffering under it. That is what long invasions do. They stop looking temporary and start rewriting baseline reality. So the question keeps circling back. If you have a tool that can kill juvenile Burmese pythons with 100% mortality at the right dose, how long can you justify not using it? And the answer keeps circling back too. As long as the same landscape contains too many things you cannot afford to poison, that is the paradox. It is not a failure of imagination. It is a collision between two true things. Florida needs a breakthrough. Florida cannot casually gamble with an ecosystem already buckling under the invasion it is trying to stop. There's another layer most casual versions of this story miss. The python problem is not simply a count problem, it is a detection problem. Field teams are not losing because they lack courage or experience. They're losing because the snake is built for invisibility. A large constrictor in dry grass would be one challenge. A large constrictor in a flooded, tangled, visually fractured wetland is another entirely. Even when the animal is physically near, the habitat edits it out. That matters because it changes what success looks like. In a normal hunt, success means finding the target. In a suppression campaign, success means changing the rate at which the target replaces itself. Those are not the same thing. Florida can celebrate removals and still be losing the deeper demographic war. That is why juvenile control became so attractive in the first place. It bypasses the hardest visual problem by targeting the stage before invisibility compounds. The machine reads that clearly. It does not get distracted by the spectacle of a giant snake on a roadside. It asks which point in the life cycle produces the most future snakes per unit of survival. Then it asks what intervention reaches that point most efficiently. If a clutch can range from 11 to 111 eggs, you do not need to remove every adult to matter. You need to stop enough of what comes next. That is cold logic. It is also persuasive logic. But then the model meets the Everglades again. Because the Everglades is not just a place with pythons in it. It is a place with trophic cascades, edge interactions, seasonal flooding, overlapping feeding zones, and rare species living inside the same broad spaces managers want to treat. A bait that lands perfectly for a juvenile python might land dangerously for something else. A bait that avoids one species in one season may not avoid it in another. Water changes movement, dry periods change concentration, nesting periods change vulnerability, migration changes contact. The map is never still long enough to make confidence feel comfortable. This is also why comparisons to Guam can mislead people if they are used lazily. Guam proved something important. It proved that a dead mouse carrying acetaminophen can become a credible control tool for an invasive snake under the right circumstances. That precedent matters. It moves the idea out of fantasy, but precedent is not transfer. A method can be valid and still fail when its ecology changes. Same weapon, different battlefield. Australia learned a version of that in its own invasive species wars. Managers there used toxicants because the damage from invasive mammals was extreme and because native species sometimes showed greater tolerance than the invaders did. In some places, the results looked promising. Then came the deeper costs. Poison moved through scavengers. Unplanned deaths appeared. Tolerance began to emerge in target populations. What first looked like a clean solution started revealing itself as an arms race with ecological debt attached. That lesson matters because Florida is not deciding whether to try something weird. Florida is deciding whether to place a lethal shortcut into one of the most complicated conservation landscapes in the country and trust that the math stays contained. The math never stays contained for long. And that may be the real aftermath no one expects when they first hear the headline. Not a cinematic pile of dead snakes, not a single shocking failure. Something harder. The discovery that the state may already possess a weapon capable of killing juvenile pythons and still be unable to use it at the scale required, because the same method threatens the world around the snake almost as much as it threatens the snake itself. That is a darker kind of trap. It means the barrier is not ignorance, it is complexity. It means the solution exists in one sense and does not exist in another. It means Florida is not facing a problem with no answers. It is facing a problem where the most powerful answers come attached to consequences large enough to erase their own value. That is the kind of thing cold analysis exposes mercilessly. Human beings love a breakthrough. We love the sentence that begins with finally. Finally, we found the vulnerability. Finally, we found the bait. Finally, we found the weak point. A machine has no affection for finally. It checks what the method touches next. And when it checks Florida, it keeps seeing the same image. Not a snake alone, a network. Juvenile python, rodent-sized bait, low vegetation, opportunistic scavenger, edge habitat, wading bird, native predator, rare cat, water, repeated deployment, uncertain uptake, invisible secondary roots, all stacked in the same frame. The room goes quiet there. Because once you see the problem at that scale, the old human instinct to simplify starts to look childish. Just poison them. Just drop more bait. Just hit the hot spots. Just keep it away from the wrong species. The Everglades hears all of that and answers with movement patterns and chance. Animals cross lines we draw for them every hour of every night. And still, the python pressure does not go away. That is what keeps this story from resolving into easy caution. If the snakes were stable, if removals were clearly winning, if native prey were rebounding, then maybe the mouse idea would fade into the archive as an interesting possibility too risky to use. But that is not the situation. The invasive population remains deeply entrenched. Reliable abundance estimates are still being developed because the species is so hard to count. Federal and state teams continue to intensify research precisely because no one pretends the current toolbox is enough. So the dead mouse remains on the table. Maybe not as a statewide answer, maybe not as an open landscape solution, but as a concept too effective to dismiss and too dangerous to deploy casually. That is the kind of limbo conservation often lives in. People imagine science as a machine for removing uncertainty. Sometimes science sharpens uncertainty until you can no longer hide from it. This is one of those cases. The python problem is clearer now than it was 10 years ago. The life stages matter more clearly. The damage to native mammals is more clearly documented. The vulnerability of juveniles to acetaminophen is no longer vague. The promise is clearer. So is the risk. Clarity does not always make action easier. Sometimes it only makes the trade-off more visible. Before I show you where this leads, if you are new here, this channel exists for exactly this kind of moment when the data stops agreeing with the story people were comfortable telling. Because the comfortable story says Florida is searching for the right tactic. The less comfortable story says Florida may already know one of the strongest tactics available and still be trapped by what that tactic would do to everything else. The difference between those two stories is enormous. In the first one, the state is one innovation away from progress. In the second, the state is in a strategic stalemate with biology itself. And once that idea sinks in, everything around the python starts to look different. The annual challenge, the contractor removals, the scout snake programs, the telemetry work, the search for breeding aggregations, the discussions of genetic control. These are not just separate tactics competing for funding. They are signs that managers are trying to build a toolbox that does not rely on one ecologically blunt instrument, no matter how seductive that instrument looks in the lab. That is the real turn. The question was never only, can poisoned mice kill pythons? We already know juvenile Burmese pythons are vulnerable. The real question is whether a system as alive and interconnected as the Everglades can survive the kind of pressure a truly effective bait campaign would have to create. Some researchers now frame the problem less as snake control and more as precision, not maximum force, maximum selectivity. That is a very different objective. It accepts that killing